So, Princess Anne just quietly erased 5 Parker Bowles names from the official royal records. And the part that actually matters here isn't even that she did it. It's that King Charles apparently gave her his personal approval to do it, which means a husband just sanctioned action against his own wife's family. And nobody seems to know how to talk about that part out loud yet. The names disappeared sometime in early 2026. No announcement, no palace statement, no coordinated leak to friendly journalists. Just an absence where there used to be a presence. The kind of thing that gets noticed first by the people who track royal rosters like it's a full-time job. Because for some of them, it basically is. Royal correspondents, palace watchers, the researchers who cross-reference duchy accounts and household records. They noticed, they started making calls, and what came back was not a denial. It was silence. And inside royal circles, silence is its own kind of answer. So, who actually got removed? Let's be specific, because the names matter here. Tom Parker Bowles is the most recognisable one. Camilla's son, food writer, author, television personality. He spent years building his own public profile, largely independent of his mother's royal status. But that independence was always partially funded by proximity. Access to the right rooms, the right events, the right people. That access was tied directly to his mother's position inside the palace, whether anyone said it out loud or not. And some of that access just got a lot harder to justify. Laura Lopes is Camilla's daughter, lower profile than her brother, but no less connected. She's appeared at royal events, maintained relationships with palace staff, and benefited from the kind of quiet institutional goodwill that comes with being the Queen Consort's child. That goodwill has limits now, and those limits just got redrawn. Beyond Tom and Laura, 3 more names connected to the wider Parker Bowles network reportedly lost their footing on various official lists. Patronages, advisory roles, the kind of soft appointments that don't generate headlines when they're given and barely generate them when they're taken away. That's by design. It's much easier to remove someone from a list nobody's publicly tracking. The removals span different categories of royal involvement. Some are financial, some are ceremonial, some are simply about access. The ability to show up at a palace event and be waved through rather than questioned. Lose that, and you lose more than people realise. Now, here's the thing about how royal rosters actually work. These lists don't update themselves. Someone decides who stays and who goes. Someone reviews the names, weighs the optics, considers the timing, and makes the call. That process doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't happen without sign-off from above. Which means 2 specific things happened here. Someone proposed these removals, and someone approved them. King Charles approved them. That combination should stop you in your tracks for a second, because Anne is not a woman who gets involved in palace housekeeping unless she has a reason. She's spent 5 decades as one of the hardest working members of the royal family, precisely by staying in her lane, doing her job and refusing to get dragged into the interpersonal drama that has swallowed so many of the royals whole. When Anne moves, it means something. And Charles approving action against his own wife's family, that's not a small thing. To understand how we got here, you have to go back about 20 years. Charles and Camilla married in April 2005. A civil ceremony at Windsor Guildhall, attended by family and close friends. The late Queen Elizabeth didn't attend the ceremony itself, though she hosted a reception afterward. The public reaction was mixed. A significant portion of Britain still associated Camilla with the breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage, and the palace knew that the rehabilitation strategy would have to be long and carefully managed. Part of that rehabilitation involved normalising the Parker Bowles family within royal spaces. Tom and Laura began appearing at events. Their names started showing up in the right places. Slowly, over years, the family became fixtures, not working royals, not on the front balcony at Buckingham Palace, but present, recognised, embedded. That process took the better part of 2 decades. What Anne just did took considerably less time. And that contrast tells you something important about how power actually works inside the palace. It takes years to build institutional presence. It takes one decision from the right person to start dismantling it. Here's a detail worth sitting with. Anne's own children, Peter Phillips and Zara Tyndall, were never placed on the royal payroll. That was a deliberate choice Anne made when they were young. They would not hold royal titles. They would not draw on palace resources. They would build their own lives. Peter works in sports management. Zara is an Olympic equestrian. Neither of them relies on crown adjacency for their income or their public profile. Anne made that call for her own kids. She is now, in effect, applying the same standard to someone else's. That's not an accident, that's a statement. When these removals first filtered into royal press circles, the initial read from some commentators was that this was about the Andrew scandal. The palace is in clean-up mode. Anything that looks like nepotism, anything that looks like a family benefiting from royal proximity without earning it, is suddenly a liability. Remove it before someone else points it out. That reading isn't wrong, but it's incomplete. Because if this were purely about optics management in the wake of Andrew's arrest in February 2026, you'd expect the response to be broader, more sweeping. You'd expect palace communications teams to be driving it. You wouldn't expect it to trace back to one specific senior royal acting with specific intent toward one specific family. The fingerprints here are Anne's, not a committee's, not a communication strategy. Anne's. Which raises the question this whole situation was always building toward. Was Anne acting on principle, on personal feelings, on instruction from William, who's been quietly consolidating authority for months, or on some combination of all three? But before we work through those possibilities, there's one more piece of this opening picture that needs to land. Camilla, by multiple accounts, did not see this coming. Not because she's naive about palace politics. She survived things that would have broken most people. She navigated 20 years of public hostility and came out the other side as Queen Consort. She's not someone who misreads rooms easily. But this came from a direction she wasn't watching. She was watching William. She was watching the Andrew fallout. She was tracking the public pressure and managing her own position with the careful attention of someone who knows exactly how fragile royal standing can be. She wasn't watching Anne, and that, more than anything else about this story, tells you how precisely this was timed. 5 names gone before anyone thought to look for them. Now let's talk about the woman who made it happen, and what Anne actually thinks of the Parker Bowles clan. Here's something most people forget about Princess Anne. She was there for all of it, not on the sidelines, not reading about it in the papers. She was inside the family when Charles and Camilla's affair was an open secret among the royals. She was there when Diana was unravelling. She was there when the marriage collapsed publicly and the institution took damage it spent the next decade trying to repair. Anne watched every chapter of that story from the inside, and she never said much about it publicly. That's the thing about Anne, she doesn't need to. What she thinks tends to show up in what she does, not in interviews, not in carefully worded statements released through palace spokespeople, but in decisions, in who she supports and who she doesn't, and where she shows up and where she pointedly doesn't. So let's look at the record. When Charles and Camilla married in April 2005, Anne attended. She sat in that Windsor Guildhall and witnessed the ceremony. She was present at the reception the Queen hosted afterward. Publicly, she was supportive. She's never made a statement against Camilla, not once. But there's a significant difference between accepting someone's presence and welcoming their extended family into the institution you've spent your entire life serving. Anne has never been photographed at a social event with Tom Parker Bowles. There's no record of her championing Laura Lopes for any royal role or patronage. The wider Parker Bowles network, the cousins, the connected names, the people who drifted into royal adjacency as Camilla's status rose. Anne has kept a consistent and notable distance from all of them. That's not an accident. Anne doesn't accidentally keep distance from people. Go back further. Before the marriage, before the affair became public knowledge, Anne and Charles grew up together. And that relationship matters here. They're the 2 eldest children of Queen Elizabeth. They share something the younger royals don't. A memory of the institution before it became a global media spectacle. A sense of what the crown is supposed to look like when it's functioning correctly. Anne has spoken in interviews about duty in a way that sounds almost old-fashioned now. She means it. She's carried out more public engagements per year than almost any other working royal for decades. She doesn't complain about it. She doesn't seek credit for it. She just does it. That value system is directly relevant to how she sees the Parker Bowles situation, because from Anne's perspective, the question was never really about Camilla. Camilla married Charles. That's done. That's settled. Anne is pragmatic enough to accept facts on the ground. The question for Anne was always about what came attached to Camilla. Tom Parker Bowles built a career in food media. Fine. Laura Lopes has her own life. Fine. But the moment their names started appearing on royal rosters, on patronage lists, in the orbit of duchy accounts and palace functions, something shifted. They weren't just Camilla's children anymore. They were becoming fixtures inside an institution that Anne believes should earn every name it carries. She watched that happen over 20 years. She didn't move immediately. That's also classic Anne. She's not impulsive. She picks her moment. What changed in early 2026 was the environment around that long-held position. Andrew's arrest in February created a palace under genuine pressure. William's growing authority gave institutional weight to the kind of reform Anne had privately supported for years. And Charles, dealing with his health and increasingly focused on legacy, was in a mindset where cleaning up loose ends made sense. Anne's views on the Parker Bowles roster didn't change. The conditions around those views finally caught up with them. One senior royal source put it simply: Anne has always believed the institution comes first. She just finally had the moment and the backing to act on it. So now you understand what Anne thinks. The more complicated question is what Charles thinks, because he didn't just allow this. According to sources, he actively sanctioned it. A husband approving action against his own wife's family. That needs explaining. King Charles III turned 76 in November 2025. He celebrated quietly, no large public gathering, a small family event, low-key by royal standards. And if you looked at the photographs from that period, you could see it. The weight he's carrying, not just the crown, but the physical reality of a man in active cancer treatment trying to hold the shape of a functioning monarchy together. He was diagnosed in February 2024. The specific type was never disclosed publicly. What we know is that treatment started immediately and has continued since. He kept working through it: engagements, audiences, state duties, the kind of discipline that doesn't get enough credit because it happens quietly, without drama, without the public knowing the full picture. But here's what that context means for this story. A king in that position thinks differently about decisions. He starts measuring things not just by what's right for today, but by what he leaves behind. Legacy becomes very concrete when your health is uncertain. And one of the things Charles has been quietly reckoning with is the question of what his reign will be remembered for, beyond the scandals that surrounded it. Andrew is part of that reckoning. The Epstein connection, the 2019 BC interview that became a masterclass in how not to handle a crisis, the arrest in February 2026. Charles watched all of it unfold and understood, perhaps better than anyone, how much damage one family member can do to an institution that takes centuries to build and can be destabilised in a single news cycle. So when Anne came to him with the proposal to remove the Parker Bowles names, Charles didn't need a long conversation. He already knew she was right. That's the part people find hard to accept, that a man would sanction the removal of his wife's family from royal rosters. It sounds cold, it sounds like a betrayal. But Charles doesn't see it that way, and understanding his logic matters here. Charles has always separated the personal from the institutional more cleanly than people give him credit for. He loves Camilla, that's not in question. He fought for decades to be with her, endured years of public hostility, and stood by her through a rehabilitation process that required enormous patience from both of them. That love is real, but Tom Parker Bowles is not Camilla. Laura Lopes is not Camilla. The wider network of names that accumulated royal adjacency over 20 years of marriage, those people are not the woman Charles married, and their presence on royal rosters is not a condition of his love for her. Charles is capable of holding both things at once: love for his wife and a clear-eyed view that her family's institutional footprint had grown beyond what the current climate could support. There's a specific pressure point that sources keep returning to: William. Over the past 12 months, William's authority inside the palace has expanded significantly. Charles has been deliberate about that. He granted William and Kate the power to issue royal warrants in 2025, a privilege monarchs have historically kept close. He has publicly positioned William as the future in ways that go beyond the usual heir-apparent framing. And privately, according to multiple sources, Charles has given William increasing latitude over decisions about the institution's direction. William had made his position on royal adjacency clear. Anyone drawing on crown proximity without a direct functional role was a liability. He'd applied that thinking to Andrew's household. He'd applied it to the broader question of which family members warranted public funding and which didn't. The Parker Bowles roster was, in William's view, exactly the kind of loose end that needed addressing. Charles heard that, and rather than creating a conflict between his son and his wife's family, he found a third path. He let Anne do it. That's the move people are missing. Charles didn't go to Camilla and tell her directly. He didn't issue a formal palace directive. He gave Anne his quiet approval and let her carry it, which means the decision has cover. It looks like institutional housekeeping rather than a husband making a unilateral call about his wife's relatives. It's cleaner, it's deniable, and it achieves exactly the same outcome. This is Charles operating the way he's always operated at his best. Not through confrontation, but through architecture, setting up the conditions for a decision to happen without being the visible hand behind it. Now, did Camilla know her husband had sanctioned this? That question is harder to answer. Sources suggest Charles did not tell her in advance. Whether that was deliberate or simply a matter of how quickly it moved is unclear. What is clear is that when the removals became known inside palace circles, Camilla's reaction indicated she had not been prepared for it. She was composed publicly. She's always composed publicly. But the people around her noticed the shift. There's one more layer to this that hasn't been widely discussed. Charles and Anne have a relationship that runs deeper than most royal observers account for. They're the two oldest. They grew up in a household defined by duty above all else. They both absorbed that value completely, in different ways and with different expressions, but it's the same root belief. The institution is bigger than any of the people inside it. When Anne came to Charles with this proposal, she wasn't asking him to choose between his wife and the crown. She was giving him a way to serve the crown without having that conversation with Camilla at all. He took it. And now the Parker Bowles family is left dealing with the consequences of a decision that was made above them, around them, and entirely without their input. Which brings us to Camilla and what she actually lost here, because it's more than 5 names on a list. Start with what Camilla still has, because it's considerable. She's Queen Consort of the United Kingdom. She lives at Buckingham Palace. She has a full complement of royal staff, official duties, and the public backing of a king who has never wavered in his support for her personally. She appears at state functions, hosts audiences, carries out engagements. On paper, her position looks secure. But position and influence are 2 different things, and it's the influence that's been shifting. Let's take stock of what the Parker Bowles removals actually cost her. In practical terms, Tom Parker Bowles lost something specific. Not a title, not a formal role. What he lost was the invisible infrastructure that royal adjacency provides. The calls that get returned faster, the invitations that arrive without being chased, the sense inside certain rooms that his presence is expected and welcome. That infrastructure was never written down anywhere, but it was real, and it derived almost entirely from his mother's position inside the palace. When your name disappears from the right lists, the infrastructure starts to quietly dismantle itself. Doors don't slam, they just stop opening as easily. Laura Lopes feels it differently. She's maintained a lower public profile than her brother, which means her royal adjacency was always more personal than professional. Access to family events, the ability to move through palace spaces without the friction that outsiders face, inclusion in the small gatherings that never make the papers but matter enormously in terms of where you stand within the family structure. That inclusion is now less certain. And in a family where certainty of standing is everything, less certain means something significant. Beyond Tom and Laura, the 3 additional names that dropped off various rosters represented something Camilla had spent years carefully constructing. A presence, a sense that the Parker Bowles family had genuinely arrived inside the institution, not just as appendages of the Queen Consort, but as recognised participants in the broader royal world. That construction just took serious damage. Now, here's what makes Camilla's position particularly complicated right now. The people she would normally turn to for support inside the palace are themselves navigating their own pressures. Charles is her husband and her most reliable ally. That hasn't changed, but Charles is also the man who quietly sanctioned what just happened to her family. She may not know the full extent of his involvement, or she may know exactly and be choosing not to confront it directly. Either way, leaning on Charles for support over this specific situation puts her in an almost impossible position. William is the other gravitational force inside the palace right now, and William's relationship with Camilla has always been functional rather than warm. He attends the same events, he's civil, he's professional, but sources who observe their interactions closely describe a consistent distance that is never fully closed. William was a 15-year-old boy when his mother died. That fact sits underneath every interaction he has with his father's second wife. Whether anyone acknowledges it or not, Camilla knows she does not have William's ear on this. She probably never expected to. What she may not have fully anticipated is Kate. Catherine, Princess of Wales, has been expanding her role inside the palace at a pace that has caught some observers off guard. Her recovery from cancer treatment, handled with remarkable transparency throughout 2024, generated a level of public affection that translated directly into institutional authority. People who admire you publicly tend to back you internally, and Kate has used that backing carefully. She's been involved in key palace decisions around the Andrew fallout. She's coordinated with staff on public response strategies. She is, by multiple accounts, functioning as a genuine co-strategist alongside William rather than a supportive figure standing adjacent to the decision-making. For Camilla, that's uncomfortable, not because she and Kate have an openly hostile relationship. They don't. Their public interactions are warm enough, but there's a structural reality here that's hard to ignore. The woman accumulating influence inside the palace right now is not Camilla's ally. She's Camilla's successor, and every step Kate takes toward the centre of palace authority is a step that redefines where the current Queen Consort stands in relation to it. Camilla's most reliable personal support right now sits outside the palace. Her sister, Annabel Elliot, who was removed from the Duchy of Cornwall payroll when William took over, understands exactly what this kind of institutional exclusion feels like. They're close, they talk, but Annabel's own removal means she's no longer in a position to provide the kind of inside counsel she once could. Sarah Ferguson is another name that keeps surfacing in this context. Camilla and Sarah have maintained their friendship despite enormous pressure to distance. Ferguson's name appearing in released Epstein documents created a new round of that pressure in early 2026. William has made his position on that friendship clear. He considers it a liability. Camilla has not walked away from it. That stubbornness is costing her. Every time Sarah Ferguson's name appears in a headline connected to the Epstein case, Camilla's decision to maintain that friendship becomes harder for palace strategists to defend. So map it out. Charles is supportive but compromised on this specific issue. William is focused on reform and not on protecting Camilla's family interests. Kate is ascending. Annabel is sidelined. Sarah Ferguson is a liability Camilla refuses to drop. The circle around Camilla is tighter than it's been at any point since she became Queen Consort. She survived tighter circles before, that's worth remembering. But she's never navigated one where the pressure was coming from this many directions at once, and where the person who just moved against her family did so with her own husband's blessing. That last part is the part that doesn't go away easily. Now, let's talk about Anne's endgame and what she's really protecting. In 1973, Princess Anne competed at the European Eventing Championships. She won. The following year, she represented Great Britain at the Montreal Olympics. She was the first British royal to compete at an Olympic Games. No special treatment, no royal exemption from the qualifying process. She earned her place on that team the same way every other athlete did. That detail matters, not because it's impressive, though it is. It matters because it tells you exactly how Anne thinks about merit. You earn your place, full stop. She's carried that standard into every corner of her royal life. More public engagements per year than almost any other working royal. Decades of it. Quietly, consistently, without the kind of public profile that generates magazine covers or social media followings. She doesn't work for visibility. She works because she believes that's what the role requires. Now apply that to what just happened with the Parker Bowles names. Anne wasn't settling a personal score. She doesn't operate that way. What she was doing was applying the same standard she's applied to everything else, including her own children, to a situation that had been bothering her for years. The Parker Bowles names on those rosters represented something specific to Anne. They represented the old way, Samis, the way things used to work inside royal circles, where proximity to power translated automatically into access, appointments, and quiet financial benefit. Where who you were related to mattered more than what you actually contributed. Anne has spent 50 years pushing against that model. Not loudly, not through public statements or reform campaigns, but through consistent personal example. Peter Phillips and Zara Tindall are proof of that. Anne chose deliberately not to give them royal titles. That decision was unusual enough at the time to generate genuine comment inside palace circles. Why would a senior royal voluntarily reduce her children's status? Because Anne didn't see it as a reduction, she saw it as a gift. The gift of building something real without the crown as a crutch. Peter and Zara did exactly that. And Anne looks at what her children built and sees the model she wanted. Independence, credibility, a relationship with the public based on actual achievement, rather than inherited proximity. The Parker Bowles situation was the inverse of that model, and it had been sitting there on official rosters for 20 years. Here's the timing element that tends to get overlooked. Anne didn't move on this during the relatively stable years of Charles's early reign. She waited. She waited until the environment inside the palace made the move both necessary and defensible. Andrew's arrest in February 2026 created that environment. The public appetite for the palace to demonstrate genuine accountability was at its highest point in years. Removing names connected to royal adjacency, names that couldn't be justified on merit grounds, was exactly the kind of concrete action that matched that moment. Anne read the moment, then she moved. There's one more thing she's protecting that doesn't get discussed enough. Her own legacy inside the institution. Anne is 75 years old. She's given more to the crown than almost anyone alive, and she's watching the monarchy navigate what may be its most consequential transition since the abdication crisis. The shift from Charles to William is not just a generational handover, it's a fundamental reimagining of what the institution is and how it operates. Anne wants to be on the right side of that reimagining, not for political reasons, but because she genuinely believes William's direction is correct. Smaller, tighter, more accountable, fewer people drawing on royal proximity without justification. She didn't just support that direction from the sidelines, she acted on it. The Parker Bowles removals are Anne's contribution to the institution she served her entire life. A concrete, deniable, precisely timed demonstration that the old rules no longer apply. And if that cost Camilla's family their place on the roster, Anne has made her peace with that. The institution, for Anne, has always come first. It still does. Now, let's look at the reaction inside the palace and what happens next. Tom Parker Bowles published a restaurant review the week after the removals became known in palace circles. Cheerful, well-written, completely normal by his usual standards. He gave no indication publicly that anything had changed. That's either composure, or he hasn't fully mapped out what the loss of that access means yet. Either way, the silence from the Parker Bowles side has been notable. No briefings to friendly journalists, no quiet pushback through royal correspondence, nothing. That silence tells you something. When people inside royal circles feel wronged and have the means to push back, they usually do. Subtly, through the right channels, but they do it. The fact that nothing has surfaced suggests one of two things. Either the family has been advised to stay quiet and is following that advice, or they understand that making noise about this would only draw attention to exactly the kind of royal adjacency the palace is trying to move away from. Complaining publicly that you lost your place on a royal roster is not a good look when the institution is under pressure to demonstrate accountability. The Parker Bowles family, whatever they feel privately, appear to have grasped that reality. Inside the palace, the reaction has been more layered. Among staff who have worked closely with Anne, there was no surprise. People who know how she operates recognised the move immediately. One source described it as vintage Anne. No announcement, no drama, just the decision made and implemented. Done. Among those closer to Camilla, the reaction was different. Sources describe a quiet fury contained behind a professional composure that everyone in that circle has learned to maintain. The anger isn't just about the removals themselves. It's about the manner of it. No conversation, no warning, no opportunity to manage it internally before it filtered out into royal press circles. Camilla is a woman who values loyalty fiercely. She stayed close to Sarah Ferguson despite enormous institutional pressure to cut that tie. She maintained friendships through decades of public hostility when many others would have retreated entirely. Loyalty is not an abstract concept to her. It's a practice. What happened here felt like the opposite of that. And the fact that her own husband had quietly sanctioned it makes the dynamic inside the palace considerably more tense than anything visible from the outside. Charles and Camilla have not, by any account, had an open confrontation about this. Their public appearances together since February have been measured and composed. A state function in early March, a joint engagement shortly after. Nothing that would indicate a visible fracture. But composed public appearances are not the same as a resolved private situation, and people inside the household know the difference. William's reaction has been the most interesting of all, because he hasn't really had one, at least not visibly. He didn't need to. Anne did what needed doing. Charles provided the cover. William's position is clean. He can pursue his reform agenda without having personally moved against his stepmother's family. The outcome he wanted was achieved without his fingerprints being the most visible ones on it. That's not an accident either. William has shown repeatedly over the past year that he understands how to achieve institutional outcomes without making himself the visible agent of every decision. It's a skill Charles developed over decades. William appears to have absorbed it faster. Kate's role in all of this has been characteristically focused. She's not involved in the Parker Bowles situation directly, but she's the person coordinating the broader palace response to the Andrew fallout, managing public communication strategy,